Do I look more handsome? All right. I got a face for radio. Brother Bill, lead us in a prayer here and we'll get started. Amen. All right. Romans chapter 14. Let me do this real quick. Romans chapter 12. I'm sorry. I kept thinking of 14 because I want to get to it because it's one of my favorite ones.
We got through those two chapters quick.
Yeah. Amber. Yeah. Mark, there's Angie. Okay, here we go. All right. Christians, or the Christian obligation. Paul begins this part. Now, up through chapter 11, Paul has provided information and presented information that could be a little difficult. And when we think about Paul's writings, and this is characteristic of his writings, often we have what we think of as a doctrinal section, and then we have what we call a practical section. Well, doctrinal means teaching, so it's all doctrinal. But we understand what the idea, what the sentiment is. So at this point in chapter 12, we're going to enter into the practical section, okay? And that's what Paul is beginning here. He turns his focus to this practical section. And he begins here with an appeal to the saints to follow these instructions, okay, that he's about to put forth. The sacrificial living set forth in this passage that he is going to talk about, it has to begin somewhere. It can't just be because God demanded that you become a living sacrifice. Now that's part of it, isn't it? God says, present yourself a living sacrifice. Be a living sacrifice. But sincere devotion has to be something that originates from within the person. You have to be a believer in what Paul's been telling you. Paul's presenting you with facts, and you have to buy into that, so to speak. You have to be a believer in those things. It has to be a part of who you are. Christianity is a taught religion. Completely different from the Jewish religion. You were born a Jew. As you grew and became older, you learned what that meant. You learned what it meant to be a Jew. You learned about your heritage coming from Abraham. You went to bed and you got up learning the laws that were given to you as a special people, Deuteronomy chapter 5. Christianity is completely different. You learn what it means to be a child of God. You learn what it means to be a Christian. You learn how to be born again. And then you become a child of God. And then you spend the balance of your life continually learning what that means and how you shape your life. And you commit yourself to it. It requires willing service. So you have to have that desire coupled with the divine commandment. Now, what did Paul base his appeal on? He said the mercies of God. Well, the mercies of God entails all those things that God has provided to us through the gospel to allow us to be a child of God, right? And so the specific thing for which Paul appeals is for each saint to present unto God a living sacrifice. Our bodies are to be holy and devoted, to be acceptable, to be free from sin, without spot, without blemish, because that's what the sacrifices have always supposed to have been, right? The ultimate sacrifice was like that, but all those sacrifices prior to, and that's what we're basing this on. It's an illustration, right? Because obviously we're not going to sacrifice ourselves in a literal sense, but we are to present our bodies as a sacrifice. And so the sacrifices of the Old Testament, they were supposed to be perfect sacrifices. You go out and you get a sacrifice, you don't get the thing that's about to die anyway. You get the best that you've got. And so you present your body the best it can be. You weren't born to sin. Your body wasn't given to you to commit fornication, to use bad language, to be drunk, to do all these kinds of things. Your body was given to you to serve God. Isn't that what Solomon said? Here's the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep His commandments, because that is the whole of man. He continued his appeal into verse 2. Do not be conformed to this world. We've been set apart. We've been sanctified. That's what sanctified means, be set apart, right? For what? God's purpose, God's holy purposes. Whatever that may be, right? Well, He set forth and told us what those things are. For His holy purposes. So how are we to not be conformed? Well, he continues with that. We're not going to be conformed by being transformed in the image of Jesus, by the renewing of our minds, okay? How do we do that? How do we renew our minds? Well, we already talked about how Christianity is a learned religion, right? Not like the Jews. You were born that way, then you learn. Christianity, you learn what that means through the study of the gospel. That's the renewing of your minds. That renewing means to be transformed, to be transfigured. Same word that we read about Jesus being transfigured, okay? Changed in His body appearance, giving His heavenly body. That's what it looked like. And so we move on to spiritual maturity. That's the renewing of our minds, okay? And that's what we're talking about. And that's what Paul's talking about. He mentioned the benevolent gift of grace in verse 3. And it was that enabled him to preach the gospel, to go do the things that he did. The grace of God allowed him to do that. And it was provided him, or it did provide him with the powers of an apostle. It gave him that apostolic office, okay? And through that apostolic office, he was able and had the authority to direct his readers to give these commandments. And one of these commandments was, don't think more highly of yourself than you ought to. Is that a problem in the world? Well, of course it is. Humanism. That's one of the problems. Humanism. People who are humanists, they're agnostic or they're atheistic because they worship themselves. That's what humanism is. Nothing greater than the person. Pride was always a problem. Israel was prideful. They had problems. What goes before destruction? Pride. Right? Pride goeth before the fall. So when it's interesting in this statement, though, the prohibition is don't think highly of yourself at all. He doesn't want us to be in condemnation of ourselves all the time. Are we supposed to have some self-confidence? Well, sure we are. It would be impossible to carry out the work of the Lord without, he ultimately did lose his life. But instead of being proud and overly confident, he said, think soberly. That means to think rationally. To think rationally. Have a proper understanding of self. Know where you are. Know where you are in your relationship with God. Know what your abilities are. Now, in this particular context, understand what your miraculous abilities are if you had them. But if you didn't have them, know what your ordinary gifts were. And that's how we're supposed to view ourselves. Understand what our abilities are in this life in serving God. Be able to look around and know what your brethren's gifts are. Right? And do that in humility. If I can look at myself and say, okay, I have the capability of doing this. Well, if I'm honest with myself, that's humility. I know that I can do certain things and I can improve in certain areas, but I know that there's certain things I can't do. So other people have to do that. And I know certain people can do other things. So we have to rely upon them to do those things. He makes a statement here, which is kind of a difficult statement, to think soberly according as God has dealt to every man the measure of faith. Well, that could mean a couple different things. It could be the miraculous gift of faith that is one of the 9 gifts that we read about in 2 Corinthians, or it could mean the measuring instrument by which we measure our thinking. Okay? That's the system of faith. Or it's either our personal faith that we do that, which is still based in the system of faith, right? So we can't go beyond the system of faith. Each has its merit. I'm not for sure, really, which one that might be. If it's for the time, it may be the miraculous, because he's talking about the measure of it. Okay? Very well could be that. As long as we're not performing miracles today, doesn't really matter. Okay? But it's one of 2 possibilities. Then he goes on to verses 4 and 5. Any comments on that or anything up to this point? He goes on to verses 4 and 5, talks about the whole body. The whole body, the church, is comprised of individual members. The members are the church. The worldly thinking of the church is what? You talk about the church, you're talking about the building, right? Or the whatever. The members are the church. And Paul's talking about that. The members make up the body, and no one member is more important than any other one member. And none of us occupy here, quote, the same office. We each have a different function. Okay? And we work in cooperation. If we all did the same thing, we wouldn't be very successful. To me, I think if you could ask, everybody would want to have the ability to lead singing. Maybe it's just because I don't have that ability. But if someone said, hey, if you could choose, what would you like to be able to do? Immediately I'd say, I would love to be able to lead singing. Because I enjoy singing, and I'd like to be able to lead singing. But what if all we could do, everybody, was to lead singing? Who's going to oversee the flock? Who's going to do the work of the deacons? Who's going to teach? Who's going to preach? Who's going to do all those other things? Well, what if in society, everybody was, I think I put in your notes, was just a carpenter or a mechanic? Who's going to do the other things? We're hurting, aren't we? Everybody fills a different office. Everybody has different abilities, and we work in conjunction to be successful. And I think it's very important, I put in your notes, that We all are members of each other. We all belong to each other. We all are a part of each other. And anytime we support and encourage and help someone else, we're doing that to ourselves. I think in general in today's world, I think we probably have lost that a lot. And Brother Jim and I have talked about this a lot. We have lost that because of social media and different things like that. You don't have the personal contact that you used to have. Well, I mean, I can remember, and Brother Micah doesn't remember this. I remember to make a phone call, you had to wait till you got somewhere, right? Unless you used that pay phone. I can remember I was up in Canada one time with the girls. They'd never seen a pay phone. We got up in Canada, there was a whole bank of them. Well, I hadn't seen one in years. And I said, come here, girls, let me show you something. And it was a whole bank of pay phones. They were almost like, well, what's that? Superman would be in trouble today, wouldn't he? He doesn't have anywhere to switch into his costume. But you don't have that anymore. And you leave home, and the first thing you think is, oh, man, I forgot my phone. Well, we made it just fine. I wish we were back to that time when you didn't have a phone with you all the time. If you wanted to get a hold of someone, you had to say, okay, well, I think they'll be there in about 10 minutes. Or you call ahead and say, when they get there, have them call back. Yeah. Or you had it worked out that you called collect, and the idea was you just said something real fast and then said, no, I don't want to take the charges. Because you could hear on the other end. Pick me up at such time. Click. We had it all worked out. But we have lost that. But see, we have it in the church. Now, isn't that why withdrawal of fellowship is supposed to work? Because we do have that in the body, and when people misbehave in the body, you withdraw. And you're starved for that. God knew what he was talking about. He knew what he was talking about. Good comments. Anything else? Well, in verses 6 through 8, God has given gifts and abilities for the good of the whole body. Okay? Notice this, that God has given one or more strengths to everybody. Isn't that the parable of the talents? Parable of the pounds? Everybody has at least one talent. Now we just have to figure out what it is. Just have to figure out what it is. And we have to improve that talent. Someone says, well, so-and-so can do this, but they're not real good at it. Well, no one was good at anything until they practiced. They got better at it. And here's something else. Just because you start out with one talent, does that mean that that's what you always have, is one talent? No. You learn and you grow and you become better at something, right? And notice on that list in verses 6 through 8, what you're going to see is some of those are supernatural. Some of them are ordinary. Not everybody in the first century had supernatural gifts. But everybody had ordinary talents. Isn't that encouraging? Everybody had ordinary talents. When we look at people today in congregations, have you ever noticed, particularly in smaller congregations, that sometimes somebody's talent is that they're good at making money? There may be like one or two people in a little old bitty congregation somewhere, and their talent is, man, they're good at making money, and they're good at giving money. They may be terrible singers. They couldn't lead a song to save their life, but they'll get in there and sing. They just can't lead a song. Can't read very well. Maybe they grew up at a time when, there wasn't a good, priority wasn't placed on education. My grandmother went to the 3rd grade. Now, I never did understand how she went to the 3rd grade and couldn't read. She couldn't read. You know, I could read when I was in the 3rd grade, but my granny couldn't read. But she had to quit school, go to work in the field, and help support her family because her mother had died. Couldn't read, but boy, she had other talents, and she wasn't stupid by any means. She's smart, she just couldn't read. But, you know, I was at a little old country congregation, and there's a fella couldn't read. His wife finally taught him how to read after their kids were all grown, and he wanted to read so he could read Scripture before the congregation. And boy, did he. And he did a good job. And I would watch him get up and read Scripture before that congregation, and it was all I could do to keep from crying every time he would get up there. And he was so proud of that, and I was proud for him. Okay? But there are just different talents like that. But, you know, I go back to those folks, they might have a talent that is making money, and they're so liberal with their giving. There might be a handful of people, but boy, they'll give money, and they'll do work all around the world out of a little old congregation, and that's all they got. But that's a talent that they have. So God has given us different talents. Any comments, questions? When we get over to verses 9 through 21, and what Paul begins to talk about here is traits of a true Christian. And he begins by telling them your love has to be real. Can't be with dissimulation. That means hypocrisy. We can't pretend to love one another. We have to have true love. Not only do we have to have true love, we have to hate that which is evil. Now look, that's not just a good idea. That's not a good suggestion that Paul puts in here. That's an apostolic commandment. You must hate that which is evil. It cannot be ignored without godly retribution. If it's evil and wicked, Christians must hate it. We must hate everything God hates. God does not love everything. God is love. And I think sometimes people misunderstand and misinterpret that. We see it all the time in these fringe groups of people, homosexuals, adulterers, philanderers, the social drinking group. Well, God just wants me to be happy. God does want us to be happy. God loves the individual. But God wants us to be happy within the parameters that He has set forth. Okay? God wants you to be miserable if you step outside those parameters. He wants you to be so miserable that you want to stop doing that and come back into His parameters. Do you think God was happy that the prodigal son was starving and miserable and lonely? That didn't make Him happy. But He didn't want him to be happy while he was living in sin. That's one of the byproducts of living in sin. Okay? Fortunately, the young man didn't die. He was able to come home. And so, we have to hate what God hates. God hates certain things. Okay? He hates sin. He hates immorality. He hates anything that is in opposition to Him or diametrically opposed to His character. He doesn't hate the sinner. He hates the sin, and we are to hate that. Okay? He hates hands that shed innocent blood. That doesn't mean He hates that individual. He hates the act of, say for example, abortion or murder, which is what abortion is, or anything like that. So, we are to hate evil, and we are to cling to that which is good. That's what cleave means. To cling to it. Where else do we hear that word cling or cleave? Way back there in Genesis chapter 2. You cleave to your spouse. If you break it apart, both things are harmed. Right? Both things are harmed. Not supposed to be separated. Okay? Not supposed to be separated. Brotherly love, and I apologize there, Mike, under number 2. That's supposed to have ly on that. I just saw it. Bothers me. Brotherly love is that tender love characterizing how we interact, how we feel toward each other. I can with confidence say I have closer relationships to members of the Lord's church than I do with my siblings. No, not even close. Not even close. Not even close. And that's to characterize that relationship within the church. And again, we're to love one another. That's just like that one before this. That's not just a good idea. It's not a suggestion. That's a divine commandment. If we don't love each other, our fellow Christians, there's going to be retribution for that from God. We can't just choose and decide that. I made mention of this, I think it was in the sermon on Sunday maybe. But, there are brethren out there that can't stand their brethren, and but they still thinking they're going to get to heaven. Well, what happens if the one you're hating so bad, what if they go to heaven? Maybe we ought to think of it that way. Someone's out. Both aren't going. Someone's out. Probably both, but we need to consider that, right? But this idea of preferring one another means showing preference or allowing that one to have his way, even if it means that I am deprived. Okay? I may not get what I want. I'm going to give way to my brother. Okay? Verse 11 in the New King James translates, not lagging in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord. I prefer that translation because the word business used in the King James Version, that is spiritual business. Okay, Paul's not giving a class here on directing one's Christian conduct in worldly business affairs. Okay, that's not what the focus is, the scope. He's talking about our Christian obligations in the spiritual world. We can't be slothful in performing our spiritual duties. Okay, we have to be zealous and earnest in our spiritual affairs. We come to worship, we do it, we're paying attention, we're zealous in that. We're zealous in carrying out the works of God when we're doing them in whatever the scenario is. We're zealous, we're minded toward that, we're focused on that. Okay? We're not indifferent. We're not indifferent. We may be indifferent about certain things in life. There are certain things in life I'm indifferent about. It's okay if it is, okay if it's not. I really don't care one way or the other. I cannot be like that about my religion. I cannot be like that about God's business. Okay? I have to be fervent about God's business. Fervent about my lifestyle as a Christian. Verses 12 through 14, we are to rejoice in hope. What does the Christian have to fear? The faithful Christian. You can have unfaithful Christians. Paul's talking about the faithful Christian. What does the faithful Christian have to fear? Well, nothing. Nothing. Faithful Christian doesn't have anything to fear. God's going to take care of us. That doesn't mean our life or our lives are going to be all rainbows and a bowl of strawberries. I don't particularly like, I like some cherries, but, it's not all going to be good times, okay? We're going to have difficulties in life. So, but what do we have to fear? What does this world have to offer? That doesn't mean we will not be anxious about impending things that we know are bad. The Lord was anxious about the coming of the cross. That's not what we're talking about. If we know that a loved one may pass or our health is deteriorating and there's just not anything we can do about it, Well, of course we're going to be anxious about that, but in the scheme of things, the faithful Christian doesn't have to fear that. We can look through that and still have peace of mind knowing that, hey, when I die, when this thing gets me, if it does, I'm going to heaven. I'm going to heaven. That gives us the peace that passes all understanding in this life. We're to be patient in tribulation. That was especially needed when Paul wrote this letter. Overt persecution. Now, brethren, we don't have that kind of persecution right now. At least we don't in the present. But it was especially needed when Paul wrote this. That means to be steadfast, to endure, to remain faithful. Now, this type of persecution that Paul is talking about was designed to put so much pressure on the Christian that they would give up their faith. But they couldn't. They had to remain steadfast and faithful to the high calling if they were going to get to heaven. And that was the whole idea. And that's why the encouragement here. Stay patient in tribulation. Hang in there. Hang in there. Okay? Now, though we don't have that kind of persecution, that doesn't mean our faith isn't under assault and being attacked by Satan. There are other things that go on. Okay? That also doesn't mean that might not happen at some point. So we have to be ready for it. Continuing instant in prayer, that's the equivalent to pray without ceasing. Distributing to the necessity of the saints. Well, that's referring to helping the poor in whatever they need. Food, shelter, clothing, medicinal things. There were some people that were in dire need. Now, what Paul's not saying here, and what he's not teaching, which is often lifted out of context here and misused, is that you can't help non-Christians out of the treasury. Not so, he's not teaching that. Because that would be a direct contradiction to Galatians chapter 6, 9 through 10. But he knew that there were Christians who were in dire straits and they needed to be helped. Now, obviously, if you have a Christian who is in desperate need, who are you going to prefer? Them or the non-Christian? Well, he just said preferring your brother, okay? Now, if you can maybe get a hold of some other people and help your Christian brother and use that for as a way to reach out to the non-Christian and maybe open up a way to convert them, well, sure, figure something out. But he specifically in this context, he's not saying you can't help non-Christians out of the treasury. He's just talking about he knew there were Christians in need. Given to hospitality, obviously, he's talking about giving lodging when necessary. There weren't easy access to things like we have, hotels, motels. There were inns. Excuse me, there were inns, but they were dangerous. They were expensive. Usually Christians couldn't afford it. And here's the thing. Christians were often fleeing away from danger. We'll talk about that in the next chapter. And they needed somewhere to stay. They might even need somewhere to hide. Therefore, open your house. Be hospitable. Bless those who persecute you. That was the chief difference between Christians and non-Christians. What is the normal reaction? Someone is ugly to you. What's the normal reaction in the world? You repay that in kind. Someone says something to you, instantly say something back. You give it as good as you get. If you can't take it, don't dish it out. Right? Been one of my greatest things I have to overcome. Not instantly repaying that in kind. I've done well over the last several years, but boy, when I was younger, I was really quick to say something in a hurry. That's not characteristic of a Christian. Okay, bless and curse not. Okay, don't retaliate. If we're to bless our persecutors, how are we to treat our fellow Christians? Weep with those who weep. Rejoice with those who rejoice. That's a golden rule. Treat those how you would like to be treated. If we're in mourning and we're hurt and we are hurt bad, we want people to be able to sympathize and empathize with us. We do that as Christians, right? We do that as Christians. Now here's one of the things I think is all too common, even among Christians sometimes. It's easier to be sad with someone than it is to be glad with them. You know, I think that happens sometimes. Someone has something great happen to them, and boy, people are easily, jealousy is aroused in them. Sometimes even envy. And you notice that Paul talks about that in different letters. Don't be envious. And listen, brethren, he's talking to Christians. If it wasn't a problem, he wouldn't talk about it. But it can be a problem to be envious. And so we want to watch that. That's something that we always need to consider. Let's be happy, particularly when Christians do well. Right? I love to see Christians do well. I remember one time, I knew, I still know him obviously. I did a funeral for a lady's mother. I knew her mother very well. But she's a millionaire. Extremely wealthy. And this other lady brought me a newspaper clipping, and her husband was on the front page about how much money their business had made. And I said, yeah, okay, good. I'm happy that they made a lot of money. But the idea was, she was like offended that they were so wealthy and they had done so well. And I told her, I said, why? Well, her husband's not a Christian, but she's a Christian, and I know for a fact that she does a lot of good stuff with her money. I was very good friends with her aunt, who was the sister to the lady I did the funeral for. And, I mean, just a top-notch family. But this other lady came to me, and she was just like and she was real prideful in her attitude toward this family, and it was sickening to me. Sickening to me. I was like, that's ridiculous. I told her too. So look, if you can't handle the truth, don't come to me with your open sin. She needed to be told that. I said, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. But let's be happy when they do well. We're not to treat others non-equally. We're to treat each other equally well. We're not to try to search out those who are high and mighty according to the world's standards. Okay? But again, nothing wrong with being wealthy. Particularly, I love it when Christians do well. But according to the world's standards, we're not to seek out people and treat them unnecessarily so much better than someone of a low estate. We're not to treat them worse because they're wealthy, but treating someone who is super wealthy or even just whatever because they're wealthier than someone who's not. Look, I grew up so poor I couldn't even pay attention, And but everybody around where I was growing up was poor. We didn't even realize it. I didn't know until I got grown how. And I told my dad, I said, "Why didn't you tell us we were poor, man?" I thought everybody ate pinto beans 5 times a week. And yeah. Boy, I look back on that and I think to myself, boy, it was, my bedroom in the winter, seriously, we had icicles on my window. I thought everybody slept under 20 quilts, I just thought that's normal. But, yeah, exactly. But we're not to treat people according to their status, okay? And then again, of course, verse 17, he renounced this rendering evil for evil. It would be so difficult in the face of persecution, someone being ugly to you, not to bite back. Yeah, exactly. You get caught up in the traffic. I can only imagine It'd have to be something similar to that, right? But we think about Jesus being treated that way. He didn't bite back, did he? We read in Isaiah, I don't know if it's 22 maybe. I don't know, Brother Jim could tell us where it talks about pulling the hair from his chin. I don't think it's 52 or 53, but it talks about pulling the hair from his chin. Can you imagine? I can't stand to shave with a dull razor. And he didn't. And then they blindfold him and cuff him in the face and asked him to prophesy who did it. And he had the power to burn the world down. And why he didn't, I don't know. But he didn't. Because of his great love, I know why he didn't. But how he could, it's just fortunate it was him and no one else. But anyway, we don't render evil for evil. And instead of that, he says, conduct your dealings with the outside world in all honesty. We put forth the greatest example we can. We want to leave a great impression of the church and live as much as in us is possible. Live peaceably with all people. You know what that indicates though, right? Sometimes it's not possible to be peaceable with the world. But who does vengeance belong to, verses 19 through 21? It belongs to God. No matter how much we want to help him out, we want to help him out and take a little load off of him, not make him do all the work. We want to say, this one instance, I'll take care of the vengeance for you, God. What happened every time we read about someone stepping up there and helping God out in his plan? Well, we're still having problems over in the Middle East because Sarah decided to help God out in his plan of bringing that promised son. Still having problems. But it's God's prerogative to punish when he decides and how he decides. He's going to take care of that. Well, all we have to do is be patient. You know, the saints under the altar, they asked Jesus, but when are you going to? I get it. They were a little anxious. They were a little frustrated, a little impatient. They had suffered greatly. But he said he would handle it. He'd take care of it. And he will. There's nothing we can do to match the punishment that he's going to dole out. Now, does that mean that we're not permitted to the right of self-defense in this life? We're going to talk about scruples here in chapter 14. If it violates their conscience to say, hey, if someone breaks in my home and, I feel like chapter 12 here says I can't defend myself, that would be a scruple. Don't violate your conscience. But I think what Paul's talking about here is waging a religious war like the Muslims wage. They're persecuting you for your religious beliefs here, so you don't fight back. You don't try to take over the world and establish your religious beliefs. Because when we look in Luke 22:36, when he sent them out on the limited commission, do you remember what he told them to do? If you don't have a sword, you go sell your coat and you go buy one. So, that's my opinion on that. Any comments, questions? All right, we've got a few minutes till the break. Let's go ahead and take a quick break, and then we'll come back, start 13, and we'll move from 13 into 14. Thank you so much.